Hello and welcome to our very first grammar video of the semester. Thanks for tuning in. We're going to talk about Chapter 1, which is a chapter full of radical new ideas. I think you'll agree. Feel free to follow along with me on your computer PowerPoint while the video plays. Chapter 1 starts off with what in my estimation is indeed a bang, which is to say there's this crazy idea going on in Chapter 1 about English being so widely spoken across the globe that there is, in fact, no one true, correct version of the English language. This is kind of a shaky, crazy, wild concept for some people. Take a minute and ask yourself, how do you really feel about this notion that there is no such thing as a perfect, true, correct English? I'm willing to bet that this is at least somewhat different than what you've been taught probably up until this point. Are you comfortable with this concept or not? Well, if you're not, and that's okay, think about this next idea, which is that even in the United States, English is spoken in a variety of different ways, or what we would call dialects. You might be familiar with one certain particular dialect, but just because that's the one you're familiar with, that doesn't mean it's the only one that's grammatical. It may be grammatical in its own way, but our book argues that, quote, every variety of English is equally grammatical, equally systematic, logical, complex, and expressive. Just because it doesn't accord with your version of English doesn't mean that it's not grammatical. Are you convinced yet? You don't have to be, of course. It's up to you whether or not you subscribe to this idea, but it's a pretty prevalent idea these days across the English spectrum. There's another thing about dialects that you want to think about too, which is regionalisms. Regionalisms, of course, are words and phrases that are predominantly used in one region of the country, as their names suggest. I'm going to ask you in your homework to think of some examples of regionalisms. Go ahead and think of some now, though, off the top of your head, if you would like to. We're also going to talk about the 3 definitions of grammar. You're probably not familiar with this concept yet because you thought there was only one version of grammar. The first definition of grammar that our book gives us is the set of rules in your head. And you probably have a very strong set of internal, subconscious grammatical rules that you've been using this whole time. Our authors actually call this version of grammar your linguistic competence. And this linguistic competence allows for rules that vary from one language community to the next. Again, thinking about different dialects will help us understand this concept. So this, again, stresses the idea that different dialects are not somehow inherently ungrammatical. The second definition of grammar is the not-so-fun definition of grammar, which is the formal description of the rules. This is not a very glamorous definition, I will grant you that. Thinking about syntax. But thinking about syntax in a conscious way is going to help you better understand what before you only understood subconsciously. So this type of grammar, this second type, this is what we'll be focusing on this semester. The third definition of grammar is the one you've probably been using to mean grammar this entire time. The conventions of common usage. This is different than your linguistic competence. This is what's known as your linguistic etiquette. This is the type of grammar that tells us what words are appropriate to use or not use in certain contexts. If anybody has ever said to you, "You have good grammar," this is what that person probably meant. One way to think about the difference between these types of grammar is this funny internet joke that I found. I'll let you read it here on your screens. I'm not going to read it to you, but it's this classic situation that we may have all encountered where you say, "Can I?" and your teacher says, "May I?" The teacher and student here engage in a debate about whether or not it's appropriate to correct usage. The teacher and student here are talking about that third definition of grammar. They're talking about linguistic etiquette. Linguistic etiquette, though, only works up until a certain point, as I think you'll agree if we think about one classic example of what we've traditionally considered to be bad grammar. The example of the word ain't. I'm sure we can all get behind the concept that ain't is not proper grammar. In fact, on my PowerPoint slides, it's been underlined in red just to illustrate to me how incorrect it is. But the reason we say that the word ain't is incorrect has absolutely nothing to do with grammar 1, the internal rules about the way language works and our linguistic competence, and has everything to do with grammar 3, linguistic etiquette. We came up with ain't as a necessary contraction, just like we would say they are not and contracted to they aren't, and she is not and contracted to isn't. Ain't is actually the contracted form of I am not. So instead of saying I'm not, we could equally easily say I ain't. I'm not saying we would, but I'm saying that we could. What makes it inappropriate isn't the internal grammatical structures of English that we've internalized, grammar 1. What makes it inappropriate is grammar 3, the linguistic etiquette that we have come to know and kind of sort of love. So you might be asking yourself, all right, we have some sort of problem with the different definitions of grammar, a difference between the internal rules of English and the rules of language etiquette. Whose fault is this? Obviously, it's Latin's fault. Latin, of course, is a complicated language, but one of its many benefits is that it's quite regular. It follows the rules almost all the time. English doesn't do that. English is complicated and quite irregular. So in the 18th century, there was a big move by a bunch of kind of snobby grammarians who decided it was best to model English more on Latin and make it follow a bunch of regular rules. This approach, of course, is called prescriptivism. Prescriptive grammar. This is the kind of thing you've been taught in school to correct the way you were already speaking. It might be fun to think of some examples of prescriptive grammar, and I'll ask you to share some of those in class. Grammatical rules you've been taught about the way to speak and what is correct. Just because this is the way it's been done to model English after Latin, though, doesn't mean it's the way it has to be done. Instead, we might think about a descriptive approach, describing the way language works when it is spoken and written. Descriptivist rather than prescriptivist. In this class, we're going to be thinking about one particular dialect of English, standard written English. This is one way to think about English, but it's not the only way. That's a big part of our study, thinking about one particular grammar, but that doesn't mean it's the only grammar that's correct, that's accessible to us. We want to think about what it means to study grammar today. We're studying the second definition of grammar. We're studying the formal description of grammar's rules. But that doesn't mean you can't be a good student of the way that language works outside of class by thinking about other kinds of grammars. One great way to do this is to think about other phrases that you hear that are outside of your particular dialect, outside of what you think of as standard English. Think of things that strike you as interesting. Another cool thing that we'll do together in class is practice using the power of the internet to think about the way that language changes. Because language does change. It changes a lot. From century to century, from year to year, we're going to be tracking those changes together in class. I think it's more useful, and your book authors think it's more useful, rather than asking yourself, gosh, is this correct or incorrect? To ask yourself the question, what's correct in context? Not just what's correct, but what's correct in this particular situation. This is important for us accepting the idea that there's no one perfect correct version of English. Rather, we want to think about how do we know what's correct when we're speaking, and how do we know what's correct when we're writing? Since there are so many different dialects open to us, ask yourself, is the way I'm speaking or writing appropriate for this situation? This is absolutely a grammar 3 question. This is a linguistic etiquette question. Does the fact that all dialects of English are equally grammatical mean we should just walk around saying ain't all the time? Of course not. We should ask ourselves rather about the appropriateness of that word in a given context. The dialect that we're studying in this class, again, is standard written American English, or what some people would call edited American English. This is what's in our newspapers, our classwork, our textbooks, but just because this is what we're studying in class doesn't mean this is the only dialect that's out there. And this is really important when we think about how language is taught in the classroom. Because if there's no one perfect, true, correct version of English, what does that mean? Does it mean that teachers shouldn't correct students anymore? Should the teacher on the previous slide not even have bothered to say, "May I?" to the student in need of a pencil? This is a good question and an important one, because it's really important that students not feel that the way they speak at home is wrong and that the way they speak in the classroom is right. Because students have a right to their own language, to their own dialect, and teachers need to respect that. At the same time, it is the teacher's job to teach students to speak and write in standard English. So, what your authors advocate is a practice called code switching, where pointing out the differences between home and classroom English is not a process about calling something correct and incorrect, but rather saying, this is one way of speaking, the home dialect, and I'm teaching you another way of speaking, the classroom dialect. This is code switching, switching from the home code to the class code. It's important to ask yourself what you think about this idea. Do you subscribe to it? If you were being taught English all over again, would you prefer this method? You want to decide, are you going to be a descriptivist or a prescriptivist? I've mentioned that we're talking together about edited American English, so you might be asking yourselves, gosh, is edited American English a fixed structure in that case? But don't be silly. We all know that English, which is so diverse and so amazing, is constantly evolving, constantly going through language change. There's a great example of this on page 10 in your textbook, and I'll be asking you to do a little homework exercise with that incredible Pinocchio translation also. The big takeaway here, though, is that we should make an effort to embrace the way that English changes rather than just clinging to an outdated idea of correctness. This is what your textbook advocates, and for the most part, I agree. Though, of course, you are entitled to your own opinion. Okay, that's all for now. Butch says, good luck with your first round of homework and welcome to our grammar class.